MBChB continues to have the lowest rate and the weakest support of breastfeeding among the nation. The breastfeeding rate in this state is 10%, which is the lowest not just in the US, but around the world. Hospital practices that specifically support breastfeeding can dramatically increase breastfeeding rate. My study examined hospital practices on breastfeeding based on the socio-ecological model. Based on this model, in order to examine any practice, whether it's individual or organization, you need to understand at least 2 levels of the 4 levels that influence that practice. So I created this framework to examine 2 levels that influence hospital practices on breastfeeding. The first level is the individual level. And based on this level, I examined the breastfeeding knowledge and practices of the hospital staff. And I focused on the maternity nurse because they are the main staff that influence mother decision to breastfeed. On the other level, I examined the hospital policies and regulation in general, whether the hospital have a policies related to breastfeeding, whether they provide a milk formula to infant, or they have training courses to the nurses, and so on. So I sent out a survey to all the hospitals that provide maternity care in this state, and I received feedback from 73% of them. The results showed that the main problem was the organizational level, the institutional level. So most of the hospitals, about 80% of them, they don't have even a written breastfeeding policy that support breastfeeding practices in this hospital. They also provide milk formula to all the infants, even those who don't have a medical indication. They also don't have any training courses that provide any assistance to the nurses or the hospital staff related to breastfeeding. Also, they don't have any support group or a hotline to breastfeeding mother. On the other side, the individual level was good. Most of the nurses, they have a good level of knowledge and the practices related to breastfeeding, and they have a positive interest on breastfeeding practices. Now, my study also examined the barriers to breastfeeding practices inside the hospital. The main barrier was the lack of government support and policies that regulate breastfeeding practices. The main barrier was, for example, the state law in California and Texas have 2 pages regulate breastfeeding practices inside the hospital, while our state have only 2 lines regulate breastfeeding practices inside the hospital. This study is the first study that examined this issue in a state that have a very low breastfeeding rate. Finding could be used to improve the breastfeeding support in this state. Thank you.